The Retort Season 1 presents expert views on the BTWC and CWC and the issues they face. This project is the product of a collaboration between Professor Lijun Shang, Professor Malcolm Dando and Dr. Brett Edwards. This initiative has been funded by the London Metropolitan University Rescaling Fund 2021, which was awarded to Professor Lijun Shang. We are grateful for this support.
Hello and welcome to this series of talks on the subject of chemical, biological weapon disarmament and non-proliferation. In this series, we will be hearing from a wide range of experts as we look towards the two major review conferences which will be taking place in coming months. In each talk, you will hear from a respected expert who will outline key opportunities and challenges in making pragmatic and holistic progress on this issue globally. This project has been kindly supported by the London Metropolitan University.
So, welcome to this edition of the Retort. I'm Jean-Pascal Zanders. I have been working in the field of chemical and biological disarmament and armament since 1986. The reason why I got interested in this field of research is basically that in that year the Belgian government had to decide whether or not to deploy American binary chemical munitions on Belgian territory as part of a NATO force goal. Chemical warfare started in Flanders, in Belgium, in the First World War, on the 22nd of April 1915 to be precise. So obviously, the option of having chemical weapons deployed on Belgian territory many decades after the end of the First World War was not a very welcome thing. At that point, I never thought I would still be working in this particular field. However, it's quite an interesting area to work in. So what happened initially, I was a trained linguist, but I went back to university, got a degree in political sciences, and then I have been working in international research institutes, such as the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, from 1996 until 2003. From Stockholm, I moved to Geneva, where I became director of the Bioweapons Prevention Project for 5 years. That was an international non-governmental organization representing many other academic or civil society organizations to the meetings at the United Nations in Geneva. From there, in 2008, I moved to Paris and I became a senior research fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies until 2013. And then I started my own independent consultancy, The Trench, which I'm still doing today. So in this particular session of the Retort, we're going to have an overview of the history of chemical and biological warfare, not necessarily of all the battles in which chemical weapons were used, but looking more precisely at the trends that shaped the possibility of chemical warfare in the First World War. I will do exactly the same thing with biological weapons too. After that, we're going to have a quick look at how international law developed to ban both first the use of chemical and biological weapons, and then also their development, production, and possession. And the final part of this presentation will look at current and emerging challenges. So, with that, let's go to the first part, which is on developments that led to modern chemical biological warfare. So, with that, let's go to the first part, which is on developments that led to modern chemical biological warfare. Well, first in the area of chemical weapons, As I've already mentioned, chemical weapons were used for the first time in 1915. However, it didn't happen just like that. There were a number of developments taking place going back many decades, even more than a century. So the first precondition we had to have for modern chemical warfare was the emergence of chemistry as a science. That started at the end of the 18th century. However, chemistry developed really fast as a science throughout the 19th century. And that one could see in the development of new analytical and production methods of toxic chemicals, and also toxic chemicals were being manufactured. In other words, poison, the word mostly used at that particular time, were derived from nature. The toxic chemicals used in the First World War were the product of science and industrialization. And we can see that if we look at some of the most important chemical warfare agents used during this First World War, well, then we'll notice that actually those products had been known for many, many decades. So, for example, chlorine as an element was first prepared in 1774. That is more than a century before the First World War. Phosgene was first prepared in 1811. Phosgene was the most important killer agent during the battles of the First World War. Again, it was already known more than a century before the battles in Europe. A mustard agent was already first described in 1822, and a useful process for producing mustard agent in larger volumes already emerged in 1886. So the interesting part is, while those toxic chemicals were known to humankind at that particular time, few people were actually thinking of them as an instrument of war. So what happened during the 19th century was that we had a confluence of several trends. And among these trends, in addition to the scientific developments I've just been mentioned, is industrialization, education, and obviously the circumstances of the First World War. So with industrialization, the second half of the 19th century was characterized by the Second Industrial Revolution. And the Second Industrial Revolution was mostly one that centered around organic chemistry, the very foundation of most of the warfare agents. So in other words, what we had emerging during that period was the science, chemistry was being used for commercial applications. And the integration of science and the large-scale production was based on an economic rationale. In other words, science became applied. It served the function of commercial industrial interests. But the important part is, of course, well, it was the ability to produce toxic chemicals in really large volumes, something that would be necessary on the battlefields several decades later. Education was also important because through education, and particularly in Germany and some other Western European countries, there was mandatory schooling for everybody until the age of 12 at the minimum, sometimes even a bit older. But what happened through the schooling was that science and technology permeated throughout society. And that had a major impact because everybody, one way or another, learned the whole process of problem identification, analysis of that problem, and then the application of technical solutions in all sectors of society. Now, this may not sound great, but everybody learning through the practice, even on the job, making minor improvements to design to production processes and so on ultimately led to improved production processes. And then finally, there was, of course, the First World War, which at the time, when it started in 1914, was the largest war we had witnessed on this planet. And one of its big characteristics, even though the signs were already there in the wars towards the end of the 19th century, but industrialization of warfare, or as we know it, total war. Every part of society is involved in the war effort. That became a key characteristic of that conflict. Now, Germany had hoped to swiftly occupy Belgium and France, defeat both countries, but it was thwarted in those efforts already in the autumn of 1914, a few months after the start of the war. So on the Western Front, the battles, they stagnated. There was no more movement. And in Germany, which at that particular time was the most advanced country in terms of chemical industry, well, what one saw was the integration of science, industry, and military art, but forced through the circumstances on the battlefield. And so the result was chemical warfare, as I've said, which started on the 22nd of April, 1915. If we look to biological warfare, we can actually see a similar types of trends emerging. Now, in the 19th century, really up to the middle of it, there were all kinds of conceptions of what disease might be. However, most importantly, the idea that disease was caused by a germ, a pathogen, that was not really commonly accepted at that particular point. So throughout the second part of the 19th century, what happened was that people were trying to understand disease. It was the emergence of biological analysis, the advancement of the medical sciences through experiences. But the key thing that was needed was really to identify the critical characteristics of disease. And it's only once those were established that disease, the germ, would be accepted as a scientific fact, something that happened towards the end of the 19th century. So the three critical characteristics were: one, infectious disease is caused by an agent. So it was not something that was out there in the air. It was not something poisonous floating around, or there was not a spontaneous origin of disease. No, there had to be a pathogen. The second precondition was establishment that the agent can be transmitted from one living organism to another. So that's the infectiveness. It has to be contagious. And finally, that may seem strange to you today, but one had to establish that one agent is responsible for one disease only. Yes, in those days, there was certain theories that a disease agent could actually be responsible for different types of infection depending on environmental conditions, for example. So one agent, one disease, that link had to be established. And it was only once that these three fundamental facts, known as the Koch postulates, that people had an agent to manipulate, which then could be used later on in warfare. But that was not all. Biological warfare also requires the ability to manipulate the pathogen. So that means, well, they exist in nature, but you have to be able to isolate the pathogen. And then in the laboratory or in the factory later on, you have to be able to cultivate it. And cultivation is not easy because in that process, you have to maintain its infectiveness. If you have succeeded in that, then you must be able to produce them in large quantities. And finally, there is the problem of dissemination. How are you going to spread the disease from person to person, from a person to an animal, or how does it spread in nature? And that latter aspect, effective dissemination, might actually be one of the more complicated aspects of biological war. Now, throughout history, biological warfare has not been that extensive, especially not if compared to chemical weapons. So, the First World War was, of course, the conflict in which chemical weapons were used on large scales. And the Germans first started in 1915, in the spring of 1915, but by the end of the war, in the autumn of 1918, about 50% of all artillery shells were filled with toxic chemicals. So you can just imagine how common chemical warfare had become during that war. Afterwards, between the two world wars, there were quite a few colonial wars during which the Allies also used chemical weapons against indigenous tribes. In 1935-36, we had Italy's colonial war in Abyssinia, and that was characterized by use of a mustard agent against the tribes. And everybody thought in the 1930s, on the eve of the Second World War, that chemical weapon use in the next conflagration would be massive, huge. And especially between the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Germany, there was a balance of terror. In particular, there was this threat of massive strategic bombing with chemical weapons against cities. And during the war, British Prime Minister Churchill, American President Roosevelt warned Germany and Japan against initiating chemical warfare based on the Norman Geneva Protocol. And Geneva Protocol I'm going to discuss a little bit later in my presentation. And contrary to all expectations, during World War II, we didn't see major chemical weapon attacks. Both the instances of biological warfare and chemical warfare took place in China by the invading Japanese forces. Why were there no major attacks? Well, the explanations do differ. On the one hand, there might have been reluctance on part of the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler because of his experiences in the trenches in the First World War, that he was against chemical warfare. Other people will point to deterrence, the fact that there was this balance of terror between the Axis powers and the Allied powers. However, there are quite a few instances where one can see that even the Western leaders were considering the use of chemical weapons at certain times. And that was certainly the case in the final stages of the conflict with Japan in the Pacific. If American troops would have invaded Japanese mainland, then there were scenarios for massive chemical weapon use to be initiated by the United States. After the Second World War, there were again several instances of use of chemical weapons in colonies, but Egyptian chemical weapon use in Yemen in the 1960s was really a bigger type of conflict, and it was the first of several major conflicts that happened in the Middle East in which chemical weapons were used. Also, we have to bear in mind in the 1960s and 1970s, the United States used herbicides, anti-plant agents on a massive scale in Southeast Asia during the war in Vietnam and neighboring countries. thereby destroying the jungle to make the opponent, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese army, visible to observers. Otherwise, they could hide in the jungle. Then, if we go back to the Middle East, 1980, 1988, we had the Iran-Iraq War, and in 1982, Iraq initiated chemical warfare. During the years until 1988, we would witness the largest scale of use of chemical weapons since the First World War. And the most recent incidents took place during the Syrian civil war, which started in 2011 and is still ongoing. However, use of chemical weapons, which started most likely in 2012 already. Some of the first reports were recorded then. However, definitely in 2013, and the last chemical attacks seem to have taken place in 2018. There haven't been many reports after March, April 2018. So that's a quick overview of the history of chemical biological warfare, with the greater emphasis on the preconditions to make a modern chemical biological warfare possible. The international community, of course, reacted to the use of chemical weapons and started developing specific international law. And it's really interesting. You will remember that I've mentioned the development of chemistry and biology in the latter half of the 19th century, and people were already becoming concerned with the potential of the chemical industry and the use of toxic chemicals on the battlefield. But before we get into the history of that, let me just summarize that today we have three main international instruments that prohibit chemical and biological weapons. The first one dates back to 1925. It's Geneva Protocol, which bans the use in war of chemical and biological weapons. The text itself is only 1 page long, and it belongs to the laws of war. It doesn't touch on the subjects of chemical weapon development, biological weapon development, production, stockpiling, or use. It was possible to have those arsenals with the Geneva Protocol in place, only you could not use it against another state that had also signed the Geneva Protocol. And that said, the Geneva Protocol is still active today, and as we shall see, it's a foundation of different initiatives in international law. Much later, in 1972, we got the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, or the BTWC. As the name it says it focuses specifically on biological weapons and toxin weapons. And toxin weapons are kind of a crossover between chemical and biological weapons. Well, chemical weapons, I've already mentioned, it's the product of science, the chemical industry, but they are not living organisms. Biological weapons are mostly pathogens, other particles that can replicate themselves like viruses, and subcellular entities. But toxins are poisons, so chemical weapon, but produced by living organisms, hence biological weapon. So in between those particular types of poisons of natural origin, they can be produced by bacteria, they can be produced by plants, think of ricin, they can be produced by animals, think of snake venom or scorpion venom. So they are a kind of between chemical and biological weapons. Covered by the BTWC, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Well, the big difference with the Geneva Protocol is that the BTWC has a comprehensive ban on the development, the production, and the possession of biological weapons. Note, I didn't mention use of biological weapons. Well, the reason for that omission was that in 1972, during the negotiation between 1969 and 1971, there was no ban on chemical weapon possession. So the convention refers to the Geneva Protocol, and the people at the time didn't want to undermine the authority of the Geneva Protocol by having it replaced by the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, and hence weaken the interdiction on the use of chemical weapons until a chemical weapons convention would be signed. What states parties did, and that was of course after the Chemical Weapons Convention had been negotiated, at the Fourth Review Conference in 1996, they declared that actually the first article of the BTWC banning development, production and possession of BWC should also cover the use of biological agents. And then the third one is, of course, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was opened for signature in 1993. And here we have a comprehensive overview of the ban on the use, the development, the production, and the possession of chemical weapons. So these three international agreements are all still effective today. Now, how did we come to those particular treaties? Well, before we come to the 19th century, there were already a number of declarations banning the use of poison in armed conflict. But that was not codified in international law. It was customary law, and one would find expression of that customary law in field manuals of the armies in the field. In the course of the second half of the 19th century, with industrialization taking off, with chemistry emerging as a science and its application in industry, people were really becoming concerned about the future of warfare. And particularly Russia, at the time, a much more agrarian society than Western Europe, well, they ambitioned to have limitations on armaments and future weapon development. And that led to the convening of the 1899 Hague Peace Conference, which was an important event. It laid the foundation for everything. It was the first time that the laws of war were codified. What has that to do with chemical and later biological weapons? Well, an interesting thing took place at the Hague Peace Conference. As I've mentioned, customary law prohibiting poison use, that was so well established, and it was taken up as one of the provisions in the Treaty on the Laws of War, the Convention on the Laws of War of 1899. And poison weapon use was banned. The interesting part was nobody discussed that particular provision. Everybody accepted it. Nobody objected. However, as I've mentioned, Russia was concerned about certain developments in the chemical industry and was particularly concerned about the manufacture of poisonous substances in large volumes. So it sought to ban what later would be known as chemical weapons. Then the term used was asphyxiating gases. So these discussions were quite controversial. Not everybody wanted to ban weapons, that had not yet been used on the battlefield, had not yet been developed. Still, a majority thought it was worthwhile to block future developments in weapon technology, and that led to a second document from the Hague Peace Conference, namely the Hague Declaration 4.2, which banned the use of projectiles whose sole purpose is the diffusion of asphyxiating gases. That was controversial, as I've mentioned. The United States refused to sign that document on the grounds that, we do not know whether that would be a more humane form of warfare than, for example, artillery or torpedoing ships in the middle of the night. So it was controversial. But the split, the bifurcation between poison, something to be found in nature, mineral poisons, the animal poisons that I've already mentioned, the toxins, versus the product of science and industrial production. And here we got a split between poisoned weapons and asphyxiating gases. Now, if I first look at the further evolution of the ban on poison weapons, a number of states signed up to the Convention on the Laws of War on Land, 1899, and then updated in 1907. After the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, the court in 1945, 1946, declared that the conventions on the laws of war from The Hague were universal. In other words, with the same stroke, the ban on the use of poison weapons became universal. That meant it applied to all states, irrespective of whether they had signed that convention or not. And that provision then was taken up in the 1998 Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court. So here you see something that had been developing through the centuries, ended up in a code at the Hague Peace Conference in 1899, and then today it is still very much a part of the Rome Statute that establishes the International Criminal Court, which the statutes, they define what war crimes are, and the use of poisoned weapons is thus a war crime. Now, the other side, respecting the asphyxiating gases, the Hague Declaration 4.2 obviously didn't survive the First World War. One of the reasons was that when Germany first used chlorine on the battlefield, it didn't use projectiles. It released the gas from cylinders. In other words, the reference to the projectiles was actually too narrow a scope to meet the realities of modern warfare. But its text, its idea, is the direct precursor of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which, as I've mentioned, bans the use of asphyxiating gases and bacteriological methods of warfare. In the first part of the presentation, I already mentioned that, the germ theory had become a scientific fact at the end of the 19th century. So, too late to be considered in the Hague Declaration 4.2, but in time for the 1925 Geneva Protocol. Interestingly, the references to bacteriological methods of warfare. So bacteria had been identified as the causative agent of disease, but it would still take until 1928 before the virus, a much smaller particle, which is not even a living organism in its own right, was established as a scientific fact. So hence the reference to bacteriological methods of warfare. And the Geneva Protocol gave us the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. Note the reference to biological, because it would cover bacterial, virus, and other infective particles. and then the Chemical Weapons Convention. And important to note, just like the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention covers toxins, the Chemical Weapons Convention covers toxins too. Now, the Geneva Protocol is still very relevant today because it gave the foundation for an investigative mechanism of the United Nations Secretary General. So in case of the use of chemical or biological weapons, he, the Secretary General, can conduct investigations at his initiative or upon request. Obviously, the Chemical Weapons Convention has its own investigative mechanism, but not all countries are yet party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and it applies to biological and toxin weapons too. The Geneva Protocol, the language in that is also included in the 1998 Rome Statute on that established the International Criminal Court. So violation of the Geneva Protocol is also a war crime. And you may wonder, why were biological and toxin weapons and chemical weapons not included in the Rome Statute? Why were those treaties, much younger, much more modern, not included? Well, some states feared that by association, the Rome Statute would also pronounce itself on nuclear weapons. And some states, possessors of nuclear weapons, didn't want to have that. So that's that part of the series. So here you have more or less an overview of the ban on biological and chemical weapons. So what are the current and emerging challenges we're facing? Well, if we had those confluences in science and technology throughout the 19th century, leading up to the First World War, well, these processes have never really stopped. And we see convergences happening between several scientific and technological domains. One is in the field of biology and chemistry. Well, you know, it's kind of easy to understand that if you think of a biological cell, it's made up of molecules, so it's chemistry. So at some point, there has to be the convergence. But looking at that interface where biology and chemistry are converging, we can see today the development of new generation of incapacitating agents. And also, in terms of biological warfare, one can start manipulating biochemical processes on subcellular levels. Nanotechnology is another such field where it is about convergence between chemistry and physics. So here we are looking at the possibility of constructing artifacts on the level of individual molecules or atoms, which may be useful for new defense technologies against chemical and biological weapons, for example, for protection or detection. But, you know, these also offer pathways to designing new types of toxic chemical agents. Informatics also plays a very big role today. So chemical, biological processes can now be designed and created on computers, and their properties can also be studied on computers. And we see that there is an increasingly fast design of new molecules and gene sequences. So, for example, new genes are being sequenced to the tune of 250,000 new ones a day. 15,000 new chemicals are being registered in the Chemical Abstract Services register each day. So many new molecules are being designed, new genes are being sequenced. And information technology can also be used to simulate a number of processes. And the final area, one of the final areas is, of course, in engineering and process designs, which can make use of many of the other technological developments to optimize those processes too. So, for example, in production, we are moving towards modular production processes, which can pose challenges for verification thresholds in treaties. Also, many production processes are now computer steered, which means that we have consistent quality. There is a reduced need for cleaning or interruptions for feeding, such as in incubation or fermentation processes. So all these developments, while they are taking place primarily for legitimate civilian purposes, because of the dual use challenge in those technologies, they can also easily be deployed for new weapon design, development, and production. So, particularly in the area of biological weapon development, there's quite a bit of concern. And I've already mentioned that manipulation of disease on subcellular levels. And we're looking at the genes, the biochemical processes, and so on. So the potential is there to make the effects of the biological agents more controllable. And also, it could lead to the production of agents with higher infectivity or an ability to overcome medical defenses. A different way of looking at biological warfare is, instead of spreading agents, is to interfere with the natural immune system. So, in other words, if you weaken the immune system of every individual, they could become the victim and possibly die of the most banal infectious disease today. There are the improvements in analytics and in production processes, so we get higher quality, higher quantities in smaller units. The technologies become commonplace. So here we have to think of a number of technologies that, 10, 15 years ago might have required a PhD level for their use, are today being used in the classroom to teach students. Remember, in the beginning, I said education was a critical aspect of the emergence of chemical weapons. Biohacker laboratories reflect that particular development. DNA data exists as digital information on computers and databases, and with 3D printing, or more formally known as additive manufacturing, that today can already lead to the construction of synthetic tissues, including the creation of pathogens one might not find in nature. Synthetic biology, nanotechnology, they can be used in agent design or dissemination technology, but as I mentioned, it's not all on the offensive side. It's also very useful in defense protection and the developments of new medication and preventative measures. And finally, they can contribute to novel ways of agent dissemination, such as aerosol techniques or the targeting of specific genes. With that, we have to ask ourselves, well, are we entering a post-proliferation era? Yeah, in the biological area, this is quite obvious that we are getting there, and pretty fast too. Biology and biotechnology are critical to both development and health, which leads to many developing countries actually conducting leading-edge research. The education is expanding everywhere, and that means that the geographical spread of knowledge to manipulate pathogens, including genetics, is reaching every corner of this planet. And research gets banalized. So it's introduced already in secondary education, and cost of equipment and processing research is dropping dramatically. In other words, it becomes available to a much larger group of people. So Also, biotechnology is essentially information, as I've already mentioned. So there are no physical goods to cross the borders. Today, it is possible for research teams to work in the cloud on the same research project, and everybody is adding to the knowledge, to the expertise that might be relevant to the development of new types of weapons. In the chemical area, similar trends are taking place. However, there we see a different type of development still, and that is many of the older chemical production processes, the older types of chemical industry, are primarily located in developing countries. So that might have consequences also in terms of the global warming, but also the cost of verification, inspecting all those chemical factories under the Chemical Weapons Convention might actually shift, the burden might shift to developing countries, and that is an issue for future discussion. Well, how do we look? We see all these developments taking place. I mean, clearly not everything is dedicated to weapon development, but there are a number of concerns. And as we've seen with the First World War, there can be a number of confluences that suddenly produce a new situation in which such weapons might be used. Today, the threat spectrum posed by chemical and biological weapons are essentially war scenarios, acts of terrorism, and also criminal acts. However, that doesn't have to lead to mass casualty events all the time or affect a great area. Because in each of these cases, war, terrorism, and criminal acts, actors will consider different types of chemical and biological agents. That will also depend on the availability of such agents, and they will have to decide on how infectious or how toxic such agents have to be. And that depends very much on their objectives, as I've mentioned, on availability and also on the technical skills and the structure of a terrorist or a criminal organization. But we shouldn't solely focus on causing harm to humans. Yes, the potential for mass casualties does exist, but it's not necessarily the most likely scenario. So besides killing people, such agents can actually be used to incapacitate. So that means that a wider range of agents become available. They are easier to collect from nature and to cultivate. The delivery may be uncomplicated, and the requirements for skills and functional specialization are much lower. Think of it, for example, in 1984, the Rhenish cult used salmonella, a common disease from eating spoiled food, for example, was used to infect over 750 people to influence local elections. No specific skills were needed beyond having one person who was a nurse with the ability to cultivate something. But salmonella is otherwise not particularly dangerous. Then we have agents against animal and plants. And then use might look at the economic impact. Again, the agents are easier to acquire and pose less of a risk to the perpetrator. And they are easy to deploy. Just think of the food chain from the farm to the shop, how many instances there are to actually poison or add an infectious agent to foodstuffs. And then finally, the possibility exists for economic and societal disruption. So here the goal becomes disrupting the functioning of utilities, commercial enterprises, or public agencies. And the range of chemical biological agents widens again, and many can actually be commercially obtained. Of course, in terrorism, exploitation of fear, exploitation of the lack of adequate preparations are critical. And it is in an unprepared society and a society that's afraid that hoaxes become effective. And in a hoax, there's not even a chemical or a biological agent in play. At the same time, while we realize those different types of threats, our concept of a chemical weapon is changing fast. Until the end of the Cold War, the arsenals of the United States, of the Soviet Union, we counted in tens of thousands of metric tons. In the Iraq-Iran war, well, the arsenals were counted in thousands of metric tons. In the civil war in Syria, well, there we were measuring arsenals in terms of hundreds of metric tons of agent and precursor chemicals. And for terrorist use, well, there we're thinking in the range of kilograms. Assassinations of individuals, well, there we're down to grams or milligrams of toxic agents. So the idea of what we understand by a chemical weapon, this is moving very fast. In terms of terrorism, well, according to statistics, less than 1/4 of 1% of all recorded terrorist events involve toxic chemicals. The fatalities with the biological weapons are also very low. I've already briefly mentioned that there were few cases of biological weapon use in war. And since the entry into force of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention in 1975, actually fewer than 100 persons were killed through deliberate disease and toxins. And actually, most of these were criminal acts, not acts of terrorism. Another trend that we have seen over the past decade or two is what I would call the opportunistic use of toxic agents. And basically, this is the use of any available toxic chemicals, things that are stored at industrial plants, facilities for water purification, and so on. Also, toxic substances that can be used in agriculture, such as pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, and so forth. So these could also be used and cause quite serious harm to humans. But if one is using any available toxic chemical as a method of warfare, it also has its core characteristics, and that's the entity resorting to opportunistic use of toxic agents does not do any development of production of the agent. So that means that the chemical attacks will cease after those available stores have been depleted. The only place where we've seen some development might be in the area of the delivery system. So in 1990, we had the first case in Sri Lanka where the Tamil Tigers used chlorine from a paper mill after their munitions ran out. In Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq during 2006 and 2007 captured lorries, trucks carrying chlorine for water purification from Syria and Jordan to Baghdad. They captured those trucks, rigged them with explosives, and then used them in suicide attacks. And in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, used chlorine in mortar bombs and improvised explosive devices between 2014 and 17. So again, it is rather rare, but it's not actually terrorism as such. It's use of toxic agents as a method of warfare by a non-state actor. And then finally, if we think of the civil war in Syria, we really have to wonder whether chemical weapons have come full circle, whether we've gone from chlorine to chlorine. On the 22nd of April 1915, chlorine was the agent released near Ypres. Between 2014 and 2018, Syria and in Iraq, there was use of chlorine as a weapon on a systematic scale. So where is the progress in all of this? In 1915, chlorine as a chemical weapon was high technology. One must know that during that first attack, 160 tons of chlorine were released over a 7-kilometer front. And about 600 tons had been produced for the chemical weapon campaign in the First World War. Today, chlorine is just a banal industrial commodity, and annual global production and trade is in the range of over 60 million metric tons. So it's produced in many countries, it's easily available, and everybody needs it every day. So that's the situation of chlorine. It's availability that is actually a key factor here. The funny part actually is that the return of chlorine is paradoxically, in my mind at least, an expression of the success of the Chemical Weapons Convention, because the more potent agents are banished. We must return to something as banal as chlorine, because other things are completely prohibited and controlled to a certain extent. Final reflection is then, well, what is happening in Ukraine today? We have Russian disinformation about chemical and biological weapon activities in Ukraine. And we have seen a number of things happening, such as the transfer of ammonia to a site in Sumy in northeast Ukraine. At least that was the Russian allegation, to stage an incident and blame the Russian invaders of Ukraine. Russia also alleges military biological activities in Ukrainian laboratories funded by the United States. But, you know, how does one deal with that type of chemical and biological allegations, which are fake, which are part of disinformation? Were there violations of the chemical and the biological and toxin weapons conventions or other international norms? In my opinion, not. I mean, there hasn't been any chemical weapon use. You know, it's not certain that actually the Iranians transferred the ammonia to the site in Sumy. That plant was a production site of ammonia. And if the Russians would have targeted, and they tried at one point, would have targeted that chemical production site with the purpose of releasing the ammonia and harming Ukrainian civilians living around that particular site or soldiers, then that would have been a clear violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But it hasn't happened. Now, the military biological activities, well, it's not certain that they are military to start off with, but military biological activities are not prohibited per se by the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. As I've mentioned, there can be research done for protection, detection, development of new medications, vaccines, and so forth. So there are public health programs and there are biodefense programs which are legitimate. But it doesn't mean that they are a violation of the BTWC. International cooperation is promoted under both convention, the chemical and biological weapons conventions. They are recommended, they are purposefully promoted, and during the meetings of the states parties under both conventions, well, that cooperation actually takes place. And then finally, we should also bear in mind that all those activities, there's a lot of reporting, both by the United States and Ukraine. And one has to know that many other countries, including Russia, undertake similar types of activities in other parts of the world. And they also report to the international community on those activities. So what we are seeing here is a new dimension of the chemical and biological weapon threat that's emerging, namely the mobilization of public opinion based on the age-old aversion of chemical biological warfare. And that is dangerous in its own right because it can form a pretext for false flag operations. People will believe it. People will believe that an attack has taken place, that a violation has taken place. So that brings me to the end of my presentation for today. So I hope that you've had a good overview of how chemical biological warfare emerged, how the international law against those weapons has evolved, and then at the end I've listed some of the challenges that we are facing today. So in other words, the whole discussion about banning chemical biological weapons, despite the existence of two major international disarmament treaties that totally ban the possession, the development, and the production of such weapons, those discussions go on. The situation changes completely. The treaties, they were negotiated with a certain conception of biological or chemical warfare in mind, and because of the different types of use of pathogens, other biochemical compounds, or toxic chemicals, they pose challenges to those treaties. So in other words, the work to ban chemical and biological weapons is ongoing, and it will be going on for a long, long time still. So, you know, if you ever have interest in contributing to the prohibition of chemical and biological weapons, well, we can use your help. So with that, goodbye, and thank you very much for listening and watching.
Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe, whether you listen to this as a podcast or watch it as a video, and please do pass it on to colleagues. And also, drop me a line if you fancy getting involved. Perhaps you want to come along and talk about a recent civil society initiative, or else come and talk about some aspect of chemical and biological weapon disarmament. We'll certainly try and continue this series, and if it works out and people like it, I will invest some more time into keeping this kind of ongoing ad hoc forum that people can use.